The long years under my step-family's roof. My name is Emily Carter. When I think back to my childhood in Austin, Texas, the first memories that come flooding in aren't warm or sweet. They're sharp as barbed wire. A constant reminder of how it feels to grow up as the outsider in your own home. I was 8 when my dad brought Linda into our lives. She came with a breeze of expensive perfume and a sharp tongue, a stylish stranger suddenly installed as my new mother figure. From the get-go, I could sense I wasn't what she bargained for. Linda always had this way of looking at me, like I was just another burden she never signed up for. The house was never loud with laughter. It was filled with small, chilly silences and little acts that let you know you didn't belong. If she bought snacks for her own kids, my favorite cookie was sure to be left out. If there were family movie nights, there was always one too few seats on the couch. I started to read a lot, more for company than for story, hiding behind thick library books piled in my room. I remember birthdays most clearly. How my cake would be last-minute grocery store vanilla, while Linda's son, Stephen, would get a homemade chocolate creation, decorated carefully with his favorite cartoon character. Linda never missed a chance to remind me that I wasn't really her responsibility. She'd say it offhand at dinner, or when she was driving us to school, her diamond ring catching the sun as she gripped the wheel. You should be grateful for what you get, Emily. Your father works hard for you, not me. Through those years, I learned the meaning of being invisible, but also the strength it gives you to survive. Every day after school, I'd sit on the front steps, waiting for Dad to come home, hoping for 5 minutes of real conversation. Most nights he worked late, double shifts at the refinery, and when he did get home, he was too tired to notice that the house had been divided into 2 camps, his new family and his daughter watching from the sidelines. It wasn't all bad, though. Strangely, growing up in that cold, neat house taught me about resilience. I found comfort in small freedoms, riding my old bike around the block, making friends at the public library, dreaming about a life where I could choose my own family. When Linda's icy comments stung, I wrote my feelings in a worn-out notebook under my bed. As the years dragged on, I promised myself that one day I'd make a home that felt like home, even if I had to build it from scratch. The decision to leave the pain behind. I remember the night I finally made the decision to walk away as vividly as if it were yesterday. I was 18, barely an adult by anyone's measure, but the weight of the years I'd spent in that icy house had aged me in ways no one could see. For months leading up to that moment, I would lie awake, staring up at the ceiling, running my fingers over the frayed edge of my blanket and, silently, asking myself, is this all there is for me? Every day I felt more like a ghost. Even my own reflection in the mirror seemed to waver, uncertain whether to stay or disappear for good. It wasn't one explosive fight or cruel comment that pushed me over the edge. It was the slow drip of disappointment, the missed birthdays, the cold dinners, the feeling of always being an outsider in my own home. I realized that if I didn't leave now, I'd end up trapped in that cycle of silence and invisibility forever. My father, as loving as he tried to be, just couldn't bridge the growing chasm between me and Linda's world. As painful as that truth was, it became the anchor for my resolve. So I quietly packed my things late one Friday night, careful not to make a sound. My worldly possessions fit into a battered navy blue backpack, a few changes of clothes, my high school diploma, a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and the spiral notebook I'd filled with half-written letters to no one. I left the key on the kitchen table with a note. Nothing dramatic, just a single line. Thank you for everything. I need to find my own way now. The air outside was thick and muggy, typical for Austin in late May. I stood on the front porch, sipping the humid darkness into my lungs, equal parts terrified and exhilarated by what I'd done. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have money, except for the $2.20s I'd been saving from my after-school job at the diner. But what I did have was a fierce determination not to let Linda, or anyone, define what I was worth ever again. Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every step down that gravel driveway felt like ripping off a bandage that had long ago grown into my skin. But with each stride, I started to feel lighter. Like maybe, just maybe, I could finally reclaim the pieces of myself that had been left behind in that house. That night, under a sky blinking with uncertain Texas stars, I made a silent promise. I would find the life I deserved, no matter how long or winding the road. Those first days, on my own, in a strange city. If leaving home felt like holding my breath underwater, my first days of independence in Dallas were more like learning to breathe all over again. The city was both exhilarating and terrifying, a puzzle that kept shifting the pieces every time I thought I recognized a pattern. With nothing but $37 to my name and a will that, until then, I didn't know could burn so hot, I stepped off the Greyhound bus with my weathered backpack digging into my shoulders. The first morning, I woke up in a cheap hostel, a room with thin walls, a creaky bed, and 3 other girls, each chasing her own escape or dream. The air smelled of instant noodle broth and tired feet. I remember lying there as the sun crept across the ceiling and thinking, this is it, Emily. This is the place you become real. There was no sense of safety, just noisy hope. Finding work was harder than I imagined. I wandered streets lined with neon-lit diners, tracing my finger over each help-wanted sign, rehearsing how I'd answer when they asked why I'd left home. The first few rejections bruised my ego, but soon rejection became just background noise. I finally landed a job bussing tables at a rundown cafe called Alice's Grill, where the regulars smelled like gasoline and cheap bourbon. My hands were endlessly sticky with syrup and soapy water, and my shoes thought about falling apart at least once a week. I kept my head down and built a routine. Shift at Alice's from noon to 8, night classes at the local community college, homework huddled under the cheap, fluorescent light in my bunk. Most days, I barely made enough to keep the rent paid on a cramped studio in Oak Cliff. I was too broke to feel lonely. Survival left no room for nostalgia. Groceries were bags of rice, bruised apples, and the occasional treat of instant mac and cheese. City life unveiled its own set of lessons. I learned how to navigate subway routes, how to feign confidence at job interviews, and how to patch up my only pair of jeans with dental floss and stubbornness. There were terrifying nights. The time a neighbor pounded on the door, drunk and shouting. The way sirens sounded at 3 a.m. The heartbreak of losing my wallet and having no one to call but myself. Yet, in those moments, I also discovered a fierce solidarity among strangers. My roommate, Tyra, was nursing the pain of her own past. She taught me how to laugh at bad dates and worse paychecks. One elderly librarian, Mrs. Tipton, became my safe harbor, slipping me sandwiches and stories when the world closed in. Small kindnesses shored up the fragile bridges I built over hungry nights. Studying economics at night, I learned not just theory, but that hope is a resource, and so is resilience. There were failures, for sure. Essays with failing grades, job interviews that ended before they began, sick days that I worked straight through because rent didn't wait. But each setback taught me something new about survival and pride. On weekends, when the city finally slowed, I'd ride my battered bike along the Trinity River and let the wind cut through everything that hurt. I would marvel at the Dallas skyline, thinking, this is my life, raw, imperfect, and entirely mine. When self-doubt crept in, I'd pull out my old notebook and write about Linda, about the emptiness of that house in Austin, about the hungry way I wanted a future that nobody could take from me. I didn't call home. I didn't attend birthdays, holidays, or pretend like I was ever going to be a part of the family I'd left behind. Those first months were a test, not just of my ability to survive, but to heal slowly, stubbornly, in a city that owed me nothing but gave me the canvas to start over. Each day, in little ways, I found pieces of myself worth saving and began to imagine the kind of woman I wanted to become. Looking back, I see now that those lonely, hard early days weren't just the beginning of my independence. They were the fire that tempered my spirit and shaped the life I was determined to create. The highs and lows on the road to success. Looking back, I sometimes wonder how I managed to keep going through those exhausting first years. That twisted path from bussing tables to finally sitting behind a desk at one of the top financial firms in Dallas. Success, for me, was not a straight shot or a sudden sunrise. It was a climb made up of skinned knees, late nights, and victories so quiet, only I could celebrate them at first. After enough semesters at community college, I saved up to transfer to the University of Texas at Dallas. This felt like moving from the shallow end of the pool to the deep, cold waters. Everyone seemed smarter, quicker, and more privileged. I clung to the lessons of hard work, taking every shift I could get, office temp, tutoring, barista on weekends. Each paycheck was hope materialized, most of it disappearing into rent or car repairs. But every month, I managed to scrape together enough for textbooks and the little luxuries that made life less gray. A new winter coat, fancy tea bags, a Friday ticket to a $5 student movie night. Making friends was slow. I wasn't flashy or loud, but I was reliable. The one who remembered deadlines and always had tissues to lend during finals. I became close with Mika, another transfer student balancing two jobs and caring for her grandmother. We bonded over ramen noodles in our shared dream of escaping the cycles we'd grown up with. Mika's faith strengthened mine. During tough weeks, she'd text reminders like, "You earned this, Emmy. Don't let your past shrink your future." We cheered each other's baby steps, internships, A on a term paper, surviving family holidays. Crisis wasn't done with me. Twice, my car broke down, and once, I landed in urgent care with a wicked case of bronchitis. But every setback made me scrappier. I learned to manage money down to the last penny, pinch grocery bills by clipping coupons, and never ever take a sick day if I could help it. I kept writing in my old notebook, now crowded with lists and hopes instead of wounds. My favorite entry reads, "You don't have to forgive everything, but you do have to forge ahead." Graduation came with little fanfare, but immense triumph. I wore a $10 thrift store dress beneath my gown, walked across the stage alone, then treated myself to the biggest cupcake I could afford from the corner bakery. That day, I didn't cry, thinking about who wasn't there. I just let myself be proud. I'd survived, I'd learned, and I had no one but myself to thank. Landing my first real job in finance was equal parts technical know-how and sheer determination. I stayed late, volunteered for the projects no one wanted, and never lied about where I'd come from. In a field full of polished resumes and shiny shoes, I built my reputation on hustle honesty, and a refusal to buckle when the going got rough. Within 4 years, after starting as an assistant, I was promoted to analyst, then team lead. The promotions weren't handed out. They were fought for, one sleepless quarter at a time. The beautiful part was finally being able to control my world. I leased a tiny but sunlit apartment all my own, bought a used but dependable Honda Civic, and hung artwork I picked out just because I loved it. I celebrated small wins, like learning the city's best taco spots or affording my own health insurance. There were lonely pangs, of course, but there was also a deep, sun-warmed contentment in knowing nobody could kick me out or make me feel small in my own space. What lingered, though, was Linda's shadow. Sometimes in my happiest moments, signing my first lease, holding my graduate diploma, even just giggling over coffee with Mika, I still felt her cold voice echo. You should be grateful for what you get. But I finally knew better. I was grateful, but not for scraps. I was grateful for the strength I'd made from nothing, the resilience I crafted stitch by stitch. Everything I had was truly mine, and no one could take that away. The twist of fate that struck my stepmother. It's strange how life circles back on you, sometimes with the softest footsteps, other times like a tidal wave that knocks you off your feet. Years went by after I'd made my own way in Dallas. I had built a quiet but content existence, a sunlight-dappled apartment, friends I could count on, and a job that, though challenging, gave me a sense of belonging I'd always craved. I hardly thought of Linda except on rare, restless nights, when a particular ache would pull me back to memories I didn't want, but couldn't shake off. One evening, as October rain flung itself against my window, I got a call. The voice on the other end was feather thin, the sort of vulnerable I'd never associated with Linda. "Emily," she whispered. My body tensed, a cold, instinctive surge of memory washing through me. Birthday cakes, silent dinners, the shiver of not belonging. She was in trouble, not the kind that brings out casseroles from neighbors or gentle advice from old friends. No, this was the kind that strips your pride bare. Her business, once carefully curated, like her manicured nails, had collapsed. Linda had always been proud of her work in boutique real estate. The way she spoke to clients in hushed, confident tones, her watch glinting in the sunlight. But the market had tanked, or maybe she'd bet too much and lost. Either way, the money, the reputation, the fancy vacations to Florida, and those designer purses all vanished in a matter of months. Now, with no savings and plenty of debts, she was living in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of Houston, scraping by with the help of distant relatives and visitations from creditors. Friends she'd once entertained at wine and cheese parties had stopped returning her calls. Even Stephen, her golden child, the one who grew up believing the world bent for him, had moved to Boston and, from what little she said, rarely checked in. Talking to Linda that night, my mind ran scenes of the old days on an endless loop. I saw her crisp, pressed shirts and the cold sweep of her perfume as she'd pass me in the hallway without a glance. I wanted to hang up, to shield my carefully rebuilt life from the shadow her voice cast. But I didn't. Instead, I listened, silent, as she poured out her desperation. A recent fire in her apartment building, insurance money tangled in red tape, her car had been repossessed, and now she feared eviction, and in a tone I'd never heard before. Not sharp, not commanding, just desperately small. She asked if I could help her out, financially or otherwise. There was a long pause, so heavy I could almost hear her swallowing pride by the mouthful. All those years, I dreamed of a moment like this, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I secretly needed to know if I'd grown strong enough to face her honestly. My fingers drummed against the windowsill, heart galloping. I remembered the nights I'd spent in Dallas, counting change for rent, patching jeans with dental floss, hoping for just one call from my family, one moment of kindness. None had ever come. My throat tightened as Linda tried to explain herself, her voice cracking. I know I wasn't perfect. I know I made mistakes, Emily. But you're my daughter too, aren't you? The words felt as brittle as the autumn leaves blowing outside. Too little, much too late. I wanted to reach out, and I wanted to run forever, in the opposite direction. I let the silence stretch between us, a chasm weighted with years of small cruelties and missed opportunities. Finally, I answered, careful, quiet, but firm. Linda, I made it on my own after leaving that house, with nothing but 2 bills in a suitcase. You never asked how I survived. I can't be your safety net, now that the world's turned upside down. Linda sobbed softly, and the sound hooked somewhere deep in my chest. I wondered how long she'd rehearsed what she would say to me if she ever had to beg for help. I wondered if she'd ever felt regret in those years when her life had been wrapped in silks and silverware, while mine had been wrapped in old notebooks and hope. She begged a little, tried to explain away her past behavior, but I was no longer the trembling girl hunched with a book at the edge of the couch, wishing for a sliver of kindness. I was a woman with my own apartment, a job I'd earned, friends who understood me, and boundaries I'd built brick by brick out of the rubble of neglect. My voice was steady as I said, Linda, I hope things get better for you, but I can't rewrite what you did, and I can't pretend it never happened. You'll have to face these hard times on your own. I could almost feel the shock through the phone, as if she'd truly never considered that I might say no. After that night, Linda didn't call again. The next day, out of habit or worry, I checked my messages, half expecting another plea. But there was nothing. At first, I felt a buzz of anxiety. Was I too harsh? Was my refusal unkind? I questioned myself, retracing every word, as if empathy for my former tormentor might somehow absolve the wounds she left. But clarity rose, slowly. There was power in not letting old ghosts dictate my present. There was strength in knowing forgiveness doesn't always mean rescue. That sometimes love is saying no. Rumors drifted in about Linda through distant acquaintances. She'd picked up cleaning jobs, stayed with a distant cousin, started going to a community center for meals. I heard she attended church sometimes, a new thing for Linda, who once found faith only in retail therapy and status. Whether she changed or just learned humility through hardship, I cannot say. I never saw her again, though sometimes, walking through the city, I'd catch a glimpse of a blonde bob in a shop window and feel that old flutter of apprehension until I remembered I was safe and her shadow could no longer reach me. The aftermath of that phone call lingered with me longer than I expected. I kept thinking about how different we all become when our worlds collapse. The pain she'd caused me wasn't erased by hers. My own healing had been a lonely road, with each step away from that fractured family, teaching me self-protection and self-respect. And yet, from a distance, I did feel a measure of pity. It's hard not to, knowing how sharp the fall can feel, how cold the dusk is after years of sunshine. But I never let it push me over the line into guilt. I remembered the promise I made to myself on that humid May night I left, never to trade my hard-earned peace for someone else's comfort, even if that someone was the person who had once called herself my mother. By then, my own life had solidified around me. Work, friends, Friday tacos, the small traditions I'd built in the absence of family. I realized that strength, for me, wasn't just in surviving the bad times, but in refusing to let them own me anymore. Maybe Linda found her own version of that lesson on the hard streets of Houston. Maybe not. But for the first time, her story was separate from mine. She became merely a chapter, not the whole book. If there is a lesson to glean from Linda's downfall, it's that kindness cannot be forced, and regret, no matter how genuine, arrives late for some debts. I moved on, and with every year, the ache faded, forgiving, but never forgetting. That night, in the glow of the Dallas skyline through my window, I wrote in my notebook, "Some storms are not yours to weather twice, facing the past and choosing my own answer the days." After Linda's call settled over my life like a restless fog, even though I'd spent years learning to silence her voice in my head, I couldn't quite ignore the echoes now. Every time I made coffee in my sunlit kitchen or locked up my quiet apartment at night, some fragment of our conversation would return. The waver in her tone, the sharp twist of desperation, her words unspooling, years too late. "You're my daughter too, aren't you?" It's funny how facing someone who caused you pain can reawaken old wounds you thought had calloused over. For so long, I'd made a silent pact with myself not to look back, not to pine for closure, not to wait for apologies that would never come. Yet here I was, wrestling with the choice before me. Did I owe Linda anything now that her world was crumbling? Did kindness require me to reach out to the very hand that once left me out in the cold? Every instinct inside me warred between long-nurtured resentment and a nagging compassion. I spent sleepless nights tangled in sheets and memory, rereading the entries I'd scribbled in my battered old notebook all those years ago. The words I'd written as a lonely girl seemed like a plea to my older self. Don't forget how it felt. Don't ever let her shadow rule over you again. I tried to approach the decision logically, listing reasons for and against helping Linda on scraps of envelopes or in the margins of work reports. My therapist, who'd seen me through enough personal storms to know my internal weather, encouraged me to prioritize my own peace. "You're not responsible for her happiness," she'd say, softly but firmly.
Look, we know you were there.
Sometimes real
Tell
strength
us what
means
happened.
choosing not to fix what you didn't break. Over mealtimes, my friends ventured their advice in gentle, non-judgmental ways. Mika reminded me to honor the girl who survived. Tyra, ever pragmatic, asked if I'd ever even received a genuine apology. Their words weren't forceful, but they nudged me toward clarity. I realized that the only one who could answer Linda's plea was the woman I had become, not the frightened girl still yearning for a mother's warmth. The city thrummed on while I remained suspended between guilt and self-preservation. I watched autumn sweep through Dallas, painting the trees in golds and reds, and thought about how everything eventually cycles back, often not to where it started, but somewhere new entirely. I remembered the little milestones that marked my own journey. The first night alone in Dallas, my first paycheck, the day I'd treated myself to flowers just because. Those moments formed a mosaic of self-worth that no one, not even Linda, could take away from me. I decided to revisit the past fully, if only to see whether it could haunt me any longer. One Sunday afternoon, I pulled out old photos, brittle and faded, but still etched with emotion. There was my dad, younger and laugh-lined. There was Linda, brisk and impeccable, never smiling at the camera when I was in the shot. I sat with these ghosts for a while, letting the bitterness rise and settle. Sometimes grieving means acknowledging that what you wanted never existed. I understood, finally, that closure wouldn't arrive in some dramatic confrontation or weepy reconciliation. It was an internal process, forged out of my own truth. So when I finally picked up the phone to respond to Linda, my mind was clear. I dialed slowly, aware of the symbolic weight behind each number. When she answered, her voice was smaller even than before, bled of its old sharpness. Maybe she'd been expecting me to cast back the same cruelty she'd shown me. But I didn't feel angry anymore, just resolved. I told her, soft but certain, that I could not be the one to save her from the consequences of her choices. Linda, I built my life without you, I said, my words flowing steady as the river I once rode my bike beside. You never looked for me when I was lonely, so I can't come running when your luck's run out. I have compassion, but I need to keep my distance to protect everything I've fought for. It wasn't a speech, just the truth as I lived it. She didn't argue, though I could hear the tears. She called me cruel at one point, but her words landed differently now. My sense of self was no longer anchored in her approval or disappointment. I listened, but I did not offer false hope. There was grief in that moment. Yes, grief for the mother I wished I'd had, for the girl who'd ached for comfort, for the life we both lost because kindness was withheld. The weeks after that call were filled with quiet turbulence. Sometimes guilt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. I'd wonder what my father would have thought. Would he call me cold, or would he be proud that I'd protected the woman I'd become? On bad nights, I'd replay the call in my head, dissecting every silence, questioning if boundaries are ever truly loving. But as time went on, I learned to trust my decision. I doubled down on self-care, long walks along the river, movie marathons with friends, chocolate croissants on Sunday mornings. I poured my focus into work, into cultivating the relationships that nourished me. Instead of building walls, I learned to set boundaries with open hands, offering forgiveness internally while refusing to carry burdens that weren't mine. The encounter with Linda was the final test of the independence I'd claimed years ago. It showed me that sometimes healing means choosing yourself, even when it looks like turning away. It means acknowledging that justice and mercy aren't always entwined, and that sometimes the only closure you get is knowing you honored your own truth. I didn't want vengeance. I didn't even want her to suffer, just to understand, perhaps for the first time, what it feels like to stand alone. In the end, I found peace, not in her remorse, but in the simple fact that my life was no longer defined by her acceptance or rejection. I was free, finally, to write chapters where she played no part. Looking back, facing Linda taught me that forgiveness is not synonymous with rescue. I could let go of anger while holding firm to my boundaries. I could wish her well, even as I refused to be her safety net. And that, in its own quiet way, felt like the ultimate act of courage. Learning to forgive, but never forget forgiveness isn't a single decision. It's a process that ebbs and flows, retreating for weeks or months, only to resurface unexpectedly when you least expect it. As the years went by, I often thought I'd mastered forgiveness. Other times, I would find myself filled with a sense of bitterness, as sharp as it was familiar. Looking back on my own journey, one thing became clear. Letting go of anger is not the same as excusing cruelty. Turning the page doesn't mean the last chapter disappears. In Dallas, as I slowly built a life surrounded by chosen family, supportive friends, and routines that nourished me, I began to truly grapple with what it meant to let go of Linda's shadow. I'd see her ghost in moments as small as catching the whiff of luxurious perfume, or as big as hearing her name mentioned in a story at work. Sometimes it ambushed me in dreams. A flicker of the old house, the silent meals, her icy, distant stare. At first, I tried to outrun these memories, busying myself with late work nights and endless social plans. But nothing ever truly kept the past at bay. Grief, too, is a process. A private winter you slog through alone until the thaw comes on its own terms. There were nights when I'd sit by my apartment window, watching the city lights flicker, feeling that old ache in my chest, wondering if I would ever truly be free. I started journaling again, like I used to as a teenager. Only now, my handwriting was steadier, each word chosen carefully. My notebook became less a litany of wounds and more a logbook of learning. I made lists, things I survived, lessons I learned, people who had surprised me with kindness. For every painful memory that surfaced, I challenged myself to counter it with something I had accomplished on my own. Some days, forgiveness seemed simple. I'd walk to work under a brilliant Texas sky and think, this is the life I carved from nothing. Linda's indifference couldn't stop me. Other days, old shame would creep in. I'd remember sitting on that front stoop, waiting for my father, the bristle of Linda's words at the dinner table, the heavy sense of not belonging to anyone. But slowly, with every passing month, those memories lost some of their sting. I found that forgiveness clings closest to the mundane rituals of everyday life. The quiet coffee in the morning, clean laundry folded on Sundays, the sound of laughter shared with friends who became my true family. In these moments, I realized that what Linda denied me wasn't mine to chase anymore. Each act of self-care became a subtle rebellion, a reclamation of the warmth and love I once waited for in vain. Perhaps the most profound realization dawned in therapy, where I learned that forgiving someone doesn't require restoring them to a place of trust. My therapist once said, "Forgiveness is for your freedom, not theirs. Compassion can coexist with distance." I didn't owe Linda, or anyone who hurt me, the comfort of being allowed back into my life. My duty was only to ensure that hurt didn't set the tone for who I became. Strange as it may seem, this process even changed how I approached other relationships. I became sensitive to the invisible wounds people around me carried. Mika's reluctance to discuss her family, Tyra's bouts of unexplained sadness, even my boss's restless perfectionism, all held echoes of their own unfinished stories. My empathy deepened. I learned to listen, to hold space, to meet others where they were, not where I wanted them to be. Yet, I never became a martyr. Forgiveness also meant I stopped excusing bad behavior, even from those I cared about. Setting boundaries was not a sign of weakness, but of growth. On more than one occasion, I found myself gently but firmly telling a friend or colleague what I could and could not carry for them. I understood at last. Letting go didn't mean letting in. Year after year, as my life took on its own rhythm, my perspective on Linda softened. I could recognize the hardships that eventually humbled her. Sometimes, I even felt sadness, watching someone who once strutted confidently through life, now walking with uncertainty in her step. There was a time I would have craved her apology, would have built myself around the hope that she might recognize the pain she'd caused. But with distance came maturity and a new acceptance that some amends are never offered. Regret, when it comes from others, rarely matches the script we write for it in our hearts. Linda's voice, fragile, faltering, pleading for help all those years after I'd left, was proof of that. I had to build my own closure. I wrote letters I never sent, had imaginary conversations in which I said all the things I'd bottled up as a girl. Sometimes, Late at night, I'd reread those unsent words just to see if they still hurt. Most of the time, they didn't. Forgiveness never erased the past, but it made it easier to breathe in the present. Some afternoons, sitting in a bustling cafe, I'd watch as families gathered, children laughing with mothers who smiled easily, and I'd feel both a pang and a sense of peace. My childhood wasn't idyllic, far from it, but it forged a resilience in me that I wouldn't trade. I no longer needed Linda's recognition to validate my journey. I was my own witness, my own best comfort. I learned to let small things slide. A rude stranger in line, an irritable coworker, the occasional biting memory. Each time, I tried to practice a gentle surrender. Acknowledge the sting, breathe, and move on. Life in Dallas became fuller because I stopped letting shadows from Austin darken every new sunrise. I cultivated a garden of habits and friendships that nourished the parts of me that once lay fallow. Still, I was honest with myself. There are wounds that stay. There are birthdays and holidays that still bring a faint ache. Even after years of independence, I learned to treat these feelings as I might treat the old scars from falling off my bike as a girl. They don't define me, but they are part of my story. I do not shy away from them. Instead, I wore them quietly, reminders of battles fought, and some, finally, won. Over time, people sometimes asked if I'd ever truly forgiven Linda. My answer grew more nuanced. I forgave her as best I could, I'd say with a smile. But forgiveness isn't about erasing memory. I will always remember. I just don't let it run my life. The fierce girl who once wrote angry secrets in a spiral notebook beneath her bed would be surprised to find peace is not about forgetting, but about living freely in spite of remembering. Forgiveness shaped not only how I saw Linda, but how I saw myself. I learned to forgive my younger self for the ways I tried to please, the countless compromises I made in search of love and acceptance, the times I thought I was unworthy of better. I no longer blame myself for what I couldn't control. That allowed me to step into my own adulthood, owning both the cracks and the light that filtered through. By the time I reached my early 30s, the anger once smoldering in my chest had faded to a gentle warmth, a sort of compassion for every version of myself that got me here. I kept the lessons, let go of the bitterness, and made space for new beginnings. I no longer flinched when I heard Linda's name. Instead, I wished her peace in my heart, hoping that somewhere, in her own ways, she was learning too. In Dallas, I marked my own holidays and invented family traditions. Potlucks with friends, movie marathons on Thanksgiving, fresh flowers on my birthday. I invited people into my story, not because I needed to fill a void, but because joy, like forgiveness, is a choice we make over and over again. I started volunteering at a local youth program, mentoring girls with stories not too different from mine. With every bit of encouragement I offered, I felt another chain broken, another weight lifted from my shoulders. Where once I saw my journey as a patchwork of trauma, I now saw it as a tapestry of strength. The world, so wide and strange, seemed to be full of hidden kindnesses, opportunities to soften old hardness. I learned, perhaps for the first time, that my worth was intrinsic, unshakable by others' failures, or my own pain. There's a power in sharing your story, not as a confession, but as a celebration of endurance and hope. It took years for me to embrace that truth. I started speaking at small events, lending my voice to discussions about overcoming adversity, about the long shadow of family wounds, and the slow, stubborn rise of self-love. Each time I spoke, I felt another layer of Linda's judgment and neglect fall away. I was no longer the silent girl on the couch, but a woman standing in her light. The deeper gift of forgiving, but not forgetting, I found, was discernment. I could see both the beauty and brokenness in others, and in myself. I could protect my hard-won happiness without barricading my heart. Slowly, imperceptibly, peace replaced the hollow ache. I stopped looking over my shoulder, stopped defining myself by omission, by what I didn't have as a child, or who didn't come to my graduations or birthdays. Instead, I chose presence, rooting myself in the here and now, savoring mornings that brought laughter, friendships that felt like home, and the bone-deep satisfaction of having survived and thrived. I knew that not everyone gets the apology or closure they crave. I knew, too, that closure wasn't a gift others could give me. It had to be forged from my own resolve, my daily choices to be softer and braver. When Linda occasionally crossed my mind, I no longer constructed angry arguments in my head or drafted letters I'd never send. She became a character in my history, neither monstrous nor pitiable, just human in her own failings. My story was my own, and I wore it proudly, without bitterness or need for vengeance. The freedom was intoxicating. If someone were to ask me now what forgiveness looks like, I would describe it as sunlight on my kitchen table, as the murmur of friends' voices carrying through the door, as the unhurried joy of knowing I am loved because I chose to love myself first. For all the years I spent wanting a mother's approval, I found that being kind to myself was the only true balm. I will not forget the past. I carry its lessons every step I take. But I refuse to let those old wounds keep bleeding, refuse to offer up my peace as payment for anyone else's regret. My forgiveness is both shield and bridge. It keeps me safe, but it also connects me to the world with understanding rather than resentment. There will always be echoes, moments when a certain phrase or gesture recalls Linda's long shadow, when a lonely night brings the chill of old memories. But I have learned not to be afraid. Each time I am tempted to look back, I check in with the woman I've become, offer her a smile, and move ahead. The past shapes me, but it does not own me. So this, truly, is what forgiveness means. To remember without rage, to give up the hope that things could have been different, and to choose, despite everything, to live fully and tenderly in my present. My journey is proof that peace is possible, that even after the harshest winters, you can coax something beautiful to bloom. And to every girl, boy, woman, or man who is learning to forgive without forgetting, I offer this simple certainty. You don't have to erase your story to write a new one. Sometimes, the act of moving forward, not in denial or anger, but in mindful acceptance, restores more than any apology ever could. In Dallas, under these wide, forgiving skies, I have found that healing is an everyday practice. Remembering my past does not steal the joy from my present. It enriches it. Each sunrise, each connection, each gentle laugh is an answer to every cruel word, every cold shoulder, every lonely hour I endured. I experienced the world not as an exile, but as a survivor, capable, compassionate, and, most importantly, free. Forgiveness is a garden I tend daily. Forgetting never was the goal.